Barbara Stevenson, and I'm the Vice Provost for Global Affairs and Chief Global Officer here at Carolina. And welcome to tonight's diplomatic discussion, the second of the semester. This speaker series, Diplomatic Discussions, is a critical part of Carolina's diplomacy initiative, which gives students a chance to grapple with some of the grand challenges of our time. And we all know that Africa is no stranger to these grand challenges. Epidemics, conflict, poverty, the climate crisis, migration, these challenges and more have shaped Africa's 54 countries and 1.3 billion people. Tonight we gather to hear from an American diplomat who spent much of her career understanding, forming, and executing U.S. foreign policy in Africa. Geeta Pasi represented the United States as ambassador on 3 separate occasions: to Djibouti from 2011 to 2014, to Chad from 2016 to 2018, and to Ethiopia from 2021 to 22. And from 2018 to 21, she served as the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of African Affairs, a key Africa policymaking position. Additionally, Ambassador Pasi served in Cameroon, Romania, Germany, Bangladesh, Ghana, and India. And throughout much of her career, she's focused on human rights, democracy, and humanitarian assistance. And she's also been a strong advocate for U.S. business overseas. Ambassador Pasi earned her bachelor's degree down the road at Duke University, and she earned her master's degree from New York University. She's originally from New York, and she speaks French, Hindi, Romanian, and German. Last year, Ambassador Pasi became the inaugural Donald F. McHenry Visiting Professor in Diplomacy and International Affairs at Illinois State University, where she shares her expertise in the classroom and, in her own words, hopes to inspire students to have an interest in some sort of service, which doesn't have to be the State Department. Public service has defined much of Ambassador Pasi's life, as it does the namesake of the endowed professorship she holds. Donald F. McHenry, who is an alumnus of Illinois State, served as U.S. Ambassador and permanent representative to the United Nations under former President Jimmy Carter. So congratulations to Ambassador Pasi on becoming the first person to hold this esteemed position. I also wish briefly to thank the American Academy of Diplomacy. I'm a proud member of the Academy, as is Geeta Pasi, and I'm delighted to be partnering with them tonight. The very first diplomatic discussion at Carolina was in a partnership with the American Academy of Diplomacy, and for a while we sponsored the podcast, The General, the Ambassador, that is Ambassador Pasi presents in. It's fair to say that our partnership with the American Academy of Diplomacy was the starting point for what's grown into the larger, multifaceted diplomacy initiative. The American Academy of Diplomacy is dedicated to enhancing the understanding of the vital role of diplomacy in our world. One of the ways they do that is through supporting this podcast called The General and the Ambassador. And in one of those episodes, U.S. Ambassador Deborah McCarthy, the host of the podcast, interviewed Admiral Mike Franken and our guest tonight, Ambassador Geeta Pasi. They discussed their firsthand experiences working throughout a region of Africa deeply affected by conflict and crisis. They also speak to the promise and possibilities of the continent, and specifically the countries where they served. So tonight I'm thrilled to introduce you to Ambassador Pasi. After she shares some of her insights with us, and before we open the floor to you, our audience, for questions, I'll join her on the stage with my colleague, Professor Naven Bapat. Professor Bapat is a professor in international relations here at Carolina. He's the chair of the curriculum in peace, war, and defense. And how many PE-wide majors? Yes. An academic program that is absolutely one of our standout strengths here at Carolina. And with that, thank you all again for being here tonight, and please join me in welcoming Ambassador Geeta Pasi.
Good evening, everybody. It's really an honor to be here. I've been here all day. I've been talking to students in classes, and some of them have heard me speak twice. I don't know if anyone's here for a third time, but trying to polish my remarks. You know, I was in the Foreign Service for quite a long time, probably before most of you were born, and my first assignment was Douala, Cameroon. And you might be thinking, who would want to go there? Well, just about everyone in my class wanted to go there. You had to be able to speak French, which at the time, many of us, you know, were able to speak French. But secondly, you got to do political and economic work, and you didn't have to do anything with visas. It was very hard to not just go to a post and be on the visa line, which is what, you know, that's become an increasingly important facet of the early careers of people in the Foreign Service. So I think out of my class of 42 people, 9 of us bid on Douala. And, you know, I was the lucky person in retrospect, and that sort of set me on a path. I never thought I would serve in Africa. I didn't know that much about Africa, but I've learned, and before I start my remarks, I want to say that I'm still learning about Africa. I learn things that surprise me every day. And when I say the term, I use the term Africa, you know, it's not a country. There are incredible differences between North Africa, South Africa, Central Africa. Even in a tiny country like Djibouti, the different ethnic groups have different views, different practices, social, cultural practices, maybe in some cases religious practices. So, you know, if people say, oh, America's all the same, you know, North Carolina is just like New York, we wouldn't take that sitting down. And it's the same for Africa, which of course is an entire continent with 1.4 billion people last we checked. Huge, diverse, and whatever we say about Africa, whatever we say, good or bad, the opposite is also true. I had an ambassador, political appointee in India, who used to say that about India. And we would always try to come up with something where the opposite is not true. Really poor. Well, they're very rich people. They're not educated. There are more PhDs in India than any other country in the world. Of course, there are over 1 billion people. But the same could be said about the continent of Africa. So I thought I would show you a few slides about Africa that will kind of give it, you know, some perspective. This is just showing, you know, various countries, maps, the flags. Let's go to the next slide to give you an idea of how big it is. This is something that I always find fascinating. There's the United States, the continental United States, India is there, China. I mean, Africa is huge. And when I was in Chad, I think it's larger than the state of Texas. That's pretty big for one country with 11 million people. We often forget how big it is. We just think it's one country, it's all lumped together. It's actually huge. When I was first a diplomat, I had read a great article about people who would mail letters from overseas to their relatives in America. So they would say, for example, Barbara Stevenson, 14 Chapel Hill Drive, Chapel Hill, North Carolina, New York. Or, you know, Professor Papat, you know, such and such, North Carolina, Florida. You know, so people thought everything was in New York, Florida, maybe Chicago. And so, you know, people think everything in Africa is one zip code. It's not. It is very diverse. All right, let's go to the next slide. This is a slide I really want to spend a few moments on. I have to say, I mentioned to Ambassador Stevenson and to Josh that I really don't like PowerPoint. In fact, I detest it. But it's really useful to show an image that explains what it is I could say in 1,000 words. Look at 1950, the biggest country was China, population, then India, the US, Russia. We're around 1920, we'll look at that. China, India, the US, Indonesia. I didn't know Indonesia was that big, it really is. Pakistan, Brazil. Now look at 2100, that's only 75 years away. Many of you will be alive. India and China have been vying for number 1 and 2 for decades. Nigeria will be the 3rd largest country. Look at where they were well, they weren't even on the map in 1950, but they were 206 million in 2020, and by 2100, they'll be 733 million. The US, number 4. Pakistan, number 5. The Democratic Republic of Congo, number 6. I mean, it's just stunning. The Democratic Republic of Congo was not on either of these lists. But this in the next 50 years, 75 years, these countries will really grow. Indonesia, Ethiopia. Ethiopia had about 115 million people in 2021, but it's going to have 294 by 2100. Tanzania and Egypt. Egypt, that's not really that surprising. It's a pretty populous country. You might say, well, who cares? They're over there and we're here. Well, here's why we care. They're going to demand seats on the UN Security Council. They're going to vote on issues. There will be migration issues. There will be challenges, water, land, groups that fight for, control over whatever arable land exists where they are. They're too big to ignore, some of these countries. And some of these countries are extremely poor. The Democratic Republic of Congo would be the wealthiest country on the continent, probably, if you just counted the mineral wealth. But that money doesn't get distributed to people in the DRC. They don't get a benefit. They don't get free education or healthcare. Companies exploit the diamonds, the gold, whatever else they have, the uranium, the rare earth minerals. And those of you does anyone plan to have an electric vehicle? Well, your battery is going to be linked to these countries, especially DRC, because of the minerals that come from there, the rare earth minerals. Let's go to the next slide. This is showing the growth of population. And the thing I just want you to take away, North America, Asia, it's about the same between 2022 and 2100. Population, it's not changing that much. Africa's changing. It's the only region in the world where things are really going up. Central America is increasing very little. South America, more or less the same. North America growing a little. Europe declining. Oceania looks like it's having a huge bump from 0 to, 1/8 of 1%. But Africa is growing tremendously. Let's take a look at the next. Africa will add, it's not just that they're growing, but people will be between 15 and 64. That means working age. That means they'll be hopefully working and contributing to the economy, but they'll also be having children. There'll be more people who'll need to be supported. And look at the graph. Africa's tending upward very quickly by 2050. In 2050, some of you will be about 45 or 50 years old. This will be in your lifetimes. It will be significant. India is increasing. China is going to lose population, which is interesting. Europe will lose population. North America, I don't really know how we're gaining population, but we are apparently. And Latin America will gain some population. But that number of people will change the world order, the workforces and work trends in the world. Already, you do see Africans who are migrating to Europe. Some of you may have seen or read about people who get on boats to leave from Libya. Their boats capsize. They don't make it to Sicily. They don't make it to Italy. They don't make it anywhere where they could land that's close, or they might get turned away. But they're going to work in those countries and have a better life. And with these numbers increasing, I think we'll see more migration to not just out of Africa, but maybe to other parts of Africa, if there are places in Africa where there's more economic opportunity. While I was in Ethiopia, there was a man who was the Ethiopian ambassador to Saudi Arabia, and his sole purpose was to send back Ethiopians who had gone to Saudi Arabia and stayed. They were not necessarily Muslim, they didn't go there on the Hajj, they went there to work and they didn't want to return. And he was supposed to send something like 7,000 a day, and that's like 10 flights or something. He'd never do it. But they had, as soon as they would be sent back, they would figure out a way to get back to Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia treated them very badly. Some of them, the women had children and they weren't married and they were treated extremely poorly, even in the delivery and the care of the children. Saudi Arabia did not want them there. And the Ethiopians had asked if they could be given a stipend, these people, when they returned. Could you give them $1,000 they can get settled in Ethiopia? And Saudi Arabia said, no way, they'll just come back and get another 1,000. And guess what complicated it? Most of them were from Tigray, which was the then restive region of Ethiopia where there's been a conflict that's going on. And Ethiopia did not want more Tigrayans back here in Ethiopia. That definitely was not on the program because they would probably, they felt, join the Tigrayan army and create more problems. So let's keep looking. The next slide, the GDP. Africa will account for 11 of the world's 20 fastest growing economies. Now, that doesn't mean that they're outpacing Poland or Vietnam, but they're growing quickly. You know, some of these growth rates are rates the US would love to have, but we started at a higher level, so we're okay. And part of the challenge in Africa in the recent years is that Africa actually was doing quite well until COVID. And a lot of things that affected us, we were able to recover. And some people argue our economy is stronger because we became involved in e-commerce and lots of things working offline. There are many downsides. I'm not saying by any stretch of the imagination that we would want a pandemic or wish it on anybody, but for Africa, it had other difficult consequences, and I don't know how long it will take them to recover. Let's take a look at the next slide. Okay, this is interesting. I like the slides coming up. Okay, Africa holds a huge proportion of the world's natural resources, and 30% of the world's minerals, 8% of the world's natural gas, 12% of the world's oil reserves, 40% of the world's gold. Of course, this is for commercial purposes, not just jewelry, but commercial purposes. And other things, plutonium, platinum, the largest reserves of cobalt, diamonds, uranium. Does anyone would like to hazard a guess why we care about what's happening to uranium around the world? Nuclear energy, nuclear weapons, very important. And if the stuff is not controlled, then if it can be picked up anywhere illegally, it could be a problem. And then 65% of the world's arable land. I told one class, I forgot which one, but you know, Ethiopia is very verdant. Not all, parts of East Africa are incredibly fertile. And countries like Saudi Arabia and India are leasing land from Ethiopia and planting vegetables, or hiring people to plant vegetables. In fact, I remember the Indian ambassador sent me a tray, a huge quantity of strawberries grown by commercial Indian farmers in Ethiopia. And they're sending them to India or selling them to other countries. And this actually was a feature in the New York Times Sunday magazine a number of years ago. Why should Ethiopia lease out its land when it can't even feed its own people? But they're leasing it out. And they say, well, we get the money and we can buy food for our people. But this is big business. Arable land is a big issue. Let's look at the next slide. This shows you the top minerals per country. But unless you're involved in chemistry, you may not really want to drill down. But look at the light blue circle, light blue country, DRC. And you know, that's a huge country, and there are many, many, many resources. Angola has copper. All of these things that we sort of take for granted, many were coming from Africa. We just didn't really know. Let's go to the next one. Now this is my favorite slide. Okay, that's your cell phone and what's in it. So let's suppose suddenly there were no DRC, there was no country with minerals on the continent of Africa. It might be hard to get the cobalt, the lithium, it might be hard to get the tantalite. I mean, some of these are words we have never even uttered, but they're essential minerals that you need for a cell phone and a computer. And where I live in Normal, Illinois, which is where Illinois State University is housed, we have Rivian motors. Has anyone seen a Rivian car, those electric cars? Those batteries are very powerful, but they need to be even more powerful because people in Chicago who have Rivian cars complained that they didn't work when it was really cold. Electric car batteries are not as efficient in really cold weather. We're gonna have to develop new technologies, but if there are no materials for them to make the batteries that people talk about the tyranny of distance, that you can't drive very far in a battery operated car. It might be really true. If they can't get batteries, they can't get the materials to have them at a cost that's feasible. Other countries have some of these minerals, but this is sort of like the mothership, these Central African countries for all of these things. Let's take a look at the next slide. Okay, it's not all rosy, not all rosy. This is a report by the Council on Foreign Relations, who did a fantastic report in February about violent extremist organizations. So I was in Chad on the extreme right, and President Deby was in charge. He had controlled that country with an iron fist. And not just that, he understood the threat of terrorism. So when there were problems in Burkina or Mali, he sent his troops without even being asked. This is a if any of you have looked at peacekeeping, you may have learned that the UN anoints countries to send peacekeepers. And they have to meet certain specifications, have training, human rights training, sensitivity. Chad just sent people before they met those specifications. Chad is like your neighbor who comes over because they see you set up the grill even though they have not been invited to the party. But now you have to put an extra steak on for them because they're there. That's what Chad did very effectively. And they are fearsome fighters. They love a fight, they're not afraid. Even if the odds are 1,000,000 to 1, they'll take the 1,000,000 to 1 as long as they can be in the fight. And they went to various countries, they helped them fight off terrorist groups and do whatever, but then Debbie died. And all of that country began to unravel, as did Niger, Burkina, Mali, where the French no longer had that edge where they could help the countries if the countries valued what they did. And then America, bringing up the rear, also was dismissed from some of these countries. Our partnerships with the militaries faded, and they said, get out of our country. And to make it worse, there are some regional organizations. The US has long supported regional organizations in Africa. We're not going to be the world's policeman, but let's have an organization like ASEAN in Asia, or organizations like this all over the world. But the West African equivalent organization told the coup plotters in Burkina, Mali, Niger, give it up, especially in Niger, reinstate the elected president. And they just said, get lost. And in the end, we could not convince them. The US couldn't convince Niger, the coup plotters, or France couldn't do it, and ECOWAS couldn't do it. I mean, that's pretty stunning when a tiny group of coup plotters can thumb their noses at the United States, France, the UN, ECOWAS. And that's what's happened. And now we have a very uncomfortable situation where we've had to go against a core principle of ours, which is you have a coup, we only give you humanitarian aid, we won't talk to you until you plan elections. Now, we're going to be talking to them. So it's really, it's something that, it's an event that has really cost the US quite a bit in how we're viewed politically in the world, and France, et cetera, not just the US. We don't stand alone. Let's take a look at the next. This shows you Islamic group activity in Africa according to different theaters. When I was in Chad, the Lake Chad Basin is there, and it had been a huge, huge body of water, and it's been shrinking. And people say, oh, it's because of climate change, it's because of this, it's because of that. We'd probably get 100 water scholars in the room, and they would be arguing about it. It might be because some of the tributaries were rerouted, and it led to massive flows of water to dams and things like that. It might be because of climate change, it might be because of many things. But it's led to a lot of instability, which Boko Haram, a terrorist group basically based in Nigeria with expanding tentacles, has really taken advantage of. But when I was at work in Chad, we didn't say we're not going to go out because Boko Haram is there, we just were careful. And the people who live in these areas, they've just come to accept that terrorism is part of their way of life. It's really shocking. I think if you live with danger all the time, you just get used to it. People who served in our embassy in Iraq were always going into shelters when there were incoming mortars, rockets, and they kind of got used to it. There was sort of gallows humor. Oh, let me grab my helmet because, oh, here comes, let me finish my beer before that happens. So there's a level of violence that is accepted. People are really not horrified by the violence. It is horrifying when we read about it, but individually, they don't have a choice. They can't say, well, I'm going to move to France because it's too dangerous in Niger or Nigeria. These are people who have no options. Let's take a look at the next slide. Foreign direct investment and inflows. As I was saying, the years that you see, it relates to things that might have happened a year or two before. So before 20 and 21, then, we're in the midst of the pandemic, even in 20, there was some investment. It's not that great. It's okay. But people sometimes say, well, why don't companies invest in Africa? Well, there are a lot of reasons. One, they don't like the risk. They're worried that if there's a lawsuit, we won't be able to prevail, even if we're right, because the courts in the country won't be fair. This is not different. I see Ambassador Stevenson is nodding. She probably had to deal with this in other parts of the world. And they can't get their return back in time. When I was in Djibouti's right on the Bab el Mandeb Strait. There's water right there. But you can't get a glass of potable water in the country. There's just not enough water. There's one small aquifer. What they should do, since they're right on the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, is desalinate the water. That's what's done in Arab Gulf states. They desalinate the water, but it takes a lot of energy, costs a lot of money. And various countries have offered to help them. We even offered to, GE makes the engines that run the turbines that desalinate the water. Why didn't they want to do it? Because it would cost the company, some companies put together a proposal, we'll charge you, let's say, $1 a gallon for the water for 10 years. And then you can charge whatever you want, you'll have paid us back. That's a lot, $1 a gallon for water. They said, no, we'll pay you 90 cents and not a penny more. And those countries said goodbye. So they have no water. They'd rather have no water than have this longer payout time because they don't value getting the water enough because they have water. They don't think about how this might change the course of history for their country. They could have more crops. That's why people don't invest. And I read a great book. I went to a conference, and the book is called, I think, Dealing with the Devil, When to Fight, When to Negotiate. And one of the examples is about IBM and a Japanese company that makes computers. Its name escapes me now, but IBM wanted to sue them because they thought they were stealing. They were partners, but IBM said, you're stealing our technology. And it's about whether to fight, would they win, would they lose? Well, Japanese court, the Japanese company would have won. American court wasn't clear they had the jurisdiction. And the Japanese felt IBM is not being fair with us. We're their partner. We're just making mainframe computers that can work with IBM. What's the problem? And eventually, IBM decided it wasn't smart to sue them. It was smart to work with them. And they came to an agreement. And that was Japan and the United States. Imagine if it were Chad or if it were Burkina Faso. Very few people have enough money and vision to deal. They want their money, they want to make a profit. They're not there to do social work. So if it's the least bit risky or it's the least bit complicated, they won't do it. And why is China investing? Well, China is not using commercial credit. China is just sending their workers, their supplies. They don't have the same market economy mentality, and they can order their companies to invest. We can't order IBM or any company to go to Africa and invest. Those countries have to earn the trust of those companies, and it's hard for them to do that. Let's keep going. Okay, I just want to talk about China. People always talk about China and Africa and Russia and Africa. We'll turn to that in a moment. But China is giving a lot of assistance. But this FDI, the foreign direct investment, it comes with some caveats. It's not a gift. You have to pay us back. And the loans are astronomically high to maintain. So people in charge of these countries, who are older men generally, sign the agreements for the loans, and their children and grandchildren are going to have to pay that back. And it's going to be, we worry about our debt. How much has it reached $1 trillion? And we worry about our being able to pay it back. These debts are just impossible to imagine given the limited GDPs and other issues that these African countries face. Some of them have stood up to China, said, we're not going to pay you back. One foreign minister told me, don't worry, ambassador, we're not going to pay them when the time comes. And that's kind of old. Yeah, we're not going to pay them. They haven't reached the point yet where China says that railway is ours or that airport's ours, you can't use it anymore. But it's a lot of money and it's a lot of debt to foist on your future generations. Let's keep going. Okay, China just had a big conference. We've had several summits where we invited African leaders to Washington twice, I think, in the last 8 years. And one was right after kind of the end of the pandemic, and President Biden invited all of the African nations. Africa's done it far more than we have, and so has Russia, by the way. They fly everyone over there. China says, we have no colonial history in Africa. That's true. We just want to help you and work with you. And why is it appealing to Africa? Because if an American company goes to Africa, they say, well, we have to make sure that we have an equal number of people from this ethnic group and that ethnic group. And if someone is physically otherwise abled, they have to be able to work here. We have to have work codes that meet US standards. We have to have all these things. And China says, here's a check. You'll have to pay us back later. Don't worry about it. Pay us back later. And we'll send some workers from China to help you. No constraints whatsoever. And it's much more appealing. If someone offers you a loan and you think you don't have to fill out all the paperwork, or don't worry, we'll handle this, a lot better than dealing with the US, where you're going to have to jump through a lot of hoops. There are a lot of I remember some, TV shows, they're pretty old, but a little kid goes to the bank and he wants to borrow money to open a lemonade stand, and the banker says, well, what kind of collateral do you have? Nothing, I have a piggy bank. Well, in order to get the loan, you had to have as much money invested in your house or whatever to get the loan. That's not true with China. You don't have to have anything. You just have to have the ability to sign on the dotted line. And years down the road, there'll be a problem. So this event was very widely attended, very successful, and sometimes people say, well, Africans, they like dealing with China. And I was telling one group of students that during WikiLeaks, there was a cable released it was a cable telegram written by a Foreign Service officer. He interviewed an African diplomat in Beijing. It was written in Beijing. What do you think about China and their assistance to your country? And he said, we love it because they give us the money. They don't hassle us about human rights. They don't make us do this and that. You just make us do all this stuff, and then you don't even give us that much money. They just give us the money and they let us decide what to do with it. So naturally, they're going to be much more popular. Let's keep going. This shows you a little bit about the Chinese development of ports. I mean, China has developed ports. They even have a military base in Djibouti now. That was something that was touched on by Admiral Franken in that podcast. The military was very worried about China coming to Djibouti because mostly they were worried that the Chinese would be able to see what we're doing, how many people do we have. A lot of intelligence is based on just observing and seeing how many people come here, go there, what equipment is flown in, how long is that plane on the ground. I mean, a lot of intelligence is pretty low tech, but China has a lot of people. They probably know how to do it very well. And then various infrastructure projects and things like that. A lot of things that the Chinese are making in Africa are very low end. I remember in my first assignment, I went to the Bata shoe factory. Bata shoes they're made in various places, but this was a Chinese equivalent to Bata, or maybe it's even called Bata, but they make those kind of flip-flop shoes. And I went to the factory and I saw the shoes being made, and they cut out the shoe, and whatever was remnants, the waste, it goes into the hopper, it gets melted down, and then they make more shoes out of it. It was like a perpetual shoe machine. I mean, you never threw anything away. They just kept making more and more shoes. And that's what people were buying to wear. They weren't buying shoes from foreign countries. They were making them in that country with Chinese materials and selling them locally. So let's keep going. We're going to talk about a few other things, but I'm going to just leave this up there, and it could be shared. These are just some interesting resources. And there are various books that I've used with my students. There are a few things I want to mention. One is called Africa Open for Business, was a BBC documentary of the year. And there are a number of videos, they're about 10 minutes long, interviewing African entrepreneurs. One of whom started a cell phone business in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And he started it, I think, around 2002 or 2003, but it was very expensive, $2, $3 a minute. People in Congo couldn't afford that, but their children in France could afford the scratch cards. You enter the number in your phone and then you have minutes. And what was fascinating was there's a lot of violence in DRC, but the people wanted cell phone coverage so bad they protected the cell towers whenever there was a possibility of a violent actor coming and knocking it down because they wanted cell phone service. I mean, there are many stories that are presented, but it is truly inspirational. For people who think Africa isn't trying to help itself, it's quite eye-opening. And then earlier, there were 2 articles being flashed up on the screen. If you like graphics, I recommend The Telegraph and also Declan Walsh from the New York Times. One person I want to mention is Yinka Adegoke. There's a online news service called Semaphore. They cover the globe, but he's the Africa editor, and I had the chance to meet him while I was at another event. And he's very thoughtful, but their coverage of Africa, if you're interested in knowing what's going on in Africa now and the story behind the story, this is a fun thing to subscribe to. Now, one thing I thought I would just mention, and we'll open it up for questions, but I haven't really talked about Russia and where we've had especially the terrorism issues. I didn't have any slides that I could really come up with about Russia, but I think you've all heard about the Wagner Group, and they're moving into Africa, not in huge numbers, but they've been welcomed open arms in Niger or Mali and places like that. It's providing senior military advice, and they're also selling weapons. When I was in Ethiopia, the Russian ambassador was, let's say, very active. Let me just leave it at that with the Ethiopian government. So when I joined the Foreign Service, the Cold War was at play, and we were fighting against Russia over Africa, and Africa today even says we're just a pawn between China, Russia, and America, and they don't like that, and that's not the way it should actually be. So Russia's not a major player in terms of numbers or money, but they're a very important player in terms of security, which is what these countries really want. And when you look at US militaries being forced out and French militaries, and the next best game in town is Russian, it's a frightening thought for what that might mean down the road. So let me wrap it up here and open the floor to your questions, because I'm sure you want to know about things I haven't touched on yet.
Now we're going to do the fireside chat.
Excellent.
Go to the middle, and David here, and I'll be here. Great. So we're going to do just a couple of questions. Dr. Bapat and I have got a couple of questions prepared. The lights are hard, but let me just see a show of hands if you think you have a question to ask. Okay, so we've got mics over here, so I'll call that out again in just a minute, but be thinking about your questions. So Geeta, I wanted to talk about the population and the economy, because this slide is quite striking. I mean, not only is there loads of growth in Africa, but it is almost the only place where there's going to be major population growth for the rest of the century, which is a new idea for us to wrap our heads around. And then you showed an optimistic slide with projected GDP growth as well. It looks pretty good, like we're on an increasing path, but when you actually divide that gross domestic product by the people, per capita GDP, it's not such a great story. I noticed this when Fareed Zakaria raised it on Global Public Square a few weeks back, and he pointed out that per capita GDP in Africa actually peaked in 2014 at about 2,390, and it's now fallen to 1,960 and hasn't come back up. And so this strikes me as cause for concern, a burgeoning population, but GDP growth not enough to keep up with it. So I know that America's not the only game in town, but if you were the American ambassador to an African country seeking to, increase their per capita GDP, where would you tell them to focus?
Well, I actually had this dilemma in Djibouti. We had our base there. We're very close to them. Djibouti did things for the United States that few other countries have ever done, with the exception of Germany, the UK, let's say, but really let us operate there in a way that was very impressive. But they wanted us to have U.S. companies invest there. I said, well, we can't force them to. We have something called a free market. That means people are free to come to the market or not come to the market. But I told them they needed to change their practices on how they, you'd go to Office A, then you have to go to Office B, then you have to go to Office C, and it's no longer done, but there was a rating of ease of doing business. And Djibouti was, maybe out of 189, it was 174, but it moved up to like 120. I was really impressed. I mean, that might not sound great to you, but it's great in the world in which I lived at that time. And I think, we encouraged them to be more competitive, to do X or Y, consider American business. But ultimately, when you look at a statistic, like the one that Fareed Zakaria presented, that's all over Africa. I could say people in Chapel Hill's their per capita income's gone up, but that doesn't mean that people in certain parts of Chicago have had an increase. And when you look at the whole continent, that is actually part of, I think, a problem of many governments, including the US. We're so desperate to say this country is a success. Well, maybe one country is successful in this way, but they're not all uniformly successful. Some students are really great. Not everyone is great. Not everyone does their homework. Not everyone had the chance to have the best education before they got to the university that they're attending. It's just hard to generalize overall continent. It's certainly true that there has been a decline, and it's great to pick statistics that tell the story that you want to tell. But overall, even if you ask Americans, people are asking, are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? We hear that just about every 4 years, I think, that comes up.
Per capita GDP in this country has demonstrably gone up.
Yes, but people still think, they're not better off.
This one, I checked it for both sub-Saharan Africa and all of Africa. It's the same kind of $400 per person drop either way you did it.
Yeah, I think some of the things that are, cost of living has really gone up. There aren't great opportunities, but I wouldn't I would say that the gap between the rich and poor is increasing. There's no, the rich are not bringing the poor along or something like that. And it's sad. It is truly sad. Some people are doing fantastically well, and a lot of people are not doing that well. David?
I guess that's a general trend, right? Just
Yes.
that happens globally, right?
Right.
Those that are doing really well tend to do really well, and those that may not, and I think COVID exacerbated some of that. As you mentioned on the continent, COVID hit fairly significantly, right? So again, I understand that you said don't generalize about the continent, which I agree about, but public opinion polling seems to poll continent-wide versus just any one particular state. And there's some interesting data out of that, whereas a few years ago, there was a poll of individuals that suggested that in views of the United States was seen quite favorably, or at least more favorably compared to China and Russia. But in a more recent poll that was more looking at elites, right? That was how American elites and Chinese elites were perceived. It looked like that was reversed, right? So it looked like Chinese elites were seen more favorably. And it was a slight movement, but Chinese elites were seen more favorably. And most global elites were sort of moving up in terms of perceptions, whereas the United States went down. Right, so I was wondering if you could comment on that and what's your sense of again, understanding it's a diverse continent, but is there anything we can learn from those data? Is there some sense out about those observations? And I think the interest would be, why is it that China continues to accelerate as do other countries, but the United States is seemingly declining on that?
Well, one thing I would say, 3 words, just show up. Chinese show up on the continent. When I was in any African country, the Chinese premier came, person X was a foreign minister, number 47, because they have more than one. He was going all over Africa for the 3rd time in 4 months. And, they were there all the time, and they were inviting Africans to come to China. Russia, the same thing. The Russians came and visited, senior Russian officials came to visit African countries on a regular basis. You can go back and look. How often has a US president gone to Africa? How often have African leaders come here for a head of state meeting? When I was in Djibouti, I was able to, work with the president of Djibouti to come to the United States and meet President Obama. And he had been in the White House when George W. Bush was in office, right after we had our base. And I can tell you, the impression that the Djiboutians had of me when I was able to get them the Oval, that's what they thought. I was getting them that meeting in the Oval Office. But I was the most popular girl in town. I think the other ambassadors were jealous because going to Washington, meeting the president, but we don't do enough of that. A second thing, which definitely, and that I think definitely affects the perception, America's never here, what have you done for us lately? Second thing is we don't really advertise what we're doing. And what we're doing, some of what we do, and I know I have a former aide colleague here, he might want to throw something at me, but I think some of what we do, we help people who really need help, who are very sick, who don't have access to medical care and different things. And in a way, we're enabling those countries to say we don't have to worry about those people because the Swiss, the Americans, HIV aid funds, global, this, that, the other, are going to take care of them. We'll take care of our military, we'll do this, we'll do that. It's sort of like they're allowed to avoid the difficult parts of governance because someone else, it shows they don't really care about their people because they should be the ones focusing on healthcare, not having handouts from other countries to do what they really need to do. But when we do things, we don't always get a lot of, we don't always advertise it. There was this is not in Africa, but I think it's illustrative. There was a terrible cyclone in Bangladesh when I was there. And we had American veterinarians. They were vets from the military and they had gone to they came to work with the Bangladeshi military because you had a lot of animals that had to be taken care of. Cyclone hit and I asked them to remain. I was the chargé. And they had all their vet equipment, they took care of cows, they took care of goats. It was right before a religious holiday and, almost all of Bangladesh is Muslim and any country that has a lot of livestock, they value the livestock as much as the people. They're part of the family and they cost a lot of money. We had the best coverage I have ever seen in my life for the US government because you had a picture of a female vet in khakis using her stethoscope to check the pregnant cow. Is the calf going to be okay? That's what resonated with the people because we actually did things that helped people who had been injured or their lands had been destroyed. We were helping them take care of their Nope, very few people died. Some people died, very few, but it was the impact on the animals, the camels, I mean the cows and other things, goats, huge difference. But we don't do that very much. We just say, well, we just train the trainers to do this or that. Well, that doesn't make an impact. That doesn't make a splash. We don't open hospitals.
If you would like to ask a question, will you please make your way to the microphone and let me get a head count. I think what I'm going to do while they're coming, Nathan, you ask your question, then we'll switch to student questions.
So I was going to ask you about the conflicts that are ongoing in the Sahel and in Western Africa with the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. We talked a little bit about this in my terrorism course before, but I was just going to ask, is there a strategy to combat these groups? Or is there an overall plan? What types of tactics do you think are more effective in dealing with these types of groups? They certainly are a concern to those in these particular countries. So is there a strategy that the United States has? And what might that actually look like?
Well, first the flip answer, if I tell you, I'll have to kill you. But I don't think there really is, because these keep evolving. I think there was before. I think personally, we didn't talk about it in the classes today, but the U.S. provides security assistance to a number of countries around the world, including in Africa. And a lot of that includes training military elites. But that doesn't help Joe Schmo get food on the table. That doesn't help somebody whose child has sickle cell anemia. That doesn't help somebody get a vaccine. That doesn't help a woman who's 14, a girl having her third child or second child who dies in childbirth. That just helps a proletarian guard that helps protect the president or the prime minister. So some of our assistance is, we say it's directed to fight against these terrorist groups, but those militaries aren't really equipped to do it. So we're spending money, but I don't know that it's really helping. I think it's really tough because these are long-standing conflicts, and it's not clear that the governments themselves prioritize them. Because if it's happening in a remote area, why do we care? I gave the example to students that there were a lot of problems in Montana, and we're here in North Carolina. We'll be upset, but it doesn't really affect us.
Let's take the first question here. Would you tell us your name before you ask your question?
Yes, ma'am. My name is Connor. I wanted to ask you a question about government corruption in Africa. So do you think that for many of those individual nations, that the solutions to some of the problems that you named, and that you named external non-African nations were scared of investing because of certain governmental problems? Do you think that the answers to those governmental problems should come from domestically within those nations, or from other African nations, or just off the continent completely, or some mix of all three?
I think that's an excellent question, and I think that you cannot force your policies down the throats of another country. It has to come from within the country. And, some African youth groups have said, we're not supporting these old, ideas where France said jump and we say how high. I mean, the new leader in Senegal is the youngest leader on the continent. And, he said, I don't buy into all of this. And corruption, a lot of new politicians are saying the right thing, that we don't support corruption. Corruption affects everything. But we can't tell people not to be corrupt. I mean, oops, there's some corruption in the United States. I think I saw people who paid to get their kids into certain schools, paid tennis pros to say their kids played tennis well. But the difference between the United States and, let's say, an unnamed country in Africa is you can be born, you can live, and you can die in America, and you don't need to engage in corruption to be born, go to the hospital, have a family, get married, buy a car, get a house. Corruption is not necessarily necessary. In some of these other places, it might affect your life in more profound ways, and not just in Africa.
Thank you.
Throughout world history, there's been a lot of exploitation of Africa from around the world, and a lot of Africa has only been decolonized in the last 100 years. So do you see the economic intervention in Africa as a threat to national sovereignty of African nations at all in the long run?
Wow. Well, I remember once I was in Chad on a trip, and I was with some foreign U.S. government officials, and there were it was a secondary city, and someone said, well, madam, we have been colonized by France, France has ruined Chad, and I said, in America, sometimes people who are adults commit crimes, and they said they were treated badly by their parents. They're 20, 24, 25, but you're 58. So there has to be a time when you have to take some responsibility. Yes, colonialism was a horrible thing, and I think we may not have realized until more recently what its effects were. It's just like, many things that plague our planet and even our own country. We don't always realize the significance until later. But, Africa has to accept that you're not going to change the history. I doubt that there's going to be a commission that says, let's give Africa X billion dollars because there were slaves that came from Ghana and ended up in the United States. So they're going to have to start where they are and improve. But instead, some of the governments have just said, oh, let me enrich myself, and I can't help this country, or I'll do whatever I can to help myself. And like the French said, Louis XIV, après moi le déluge, after me, who cares? And that is a true problem. About destabilizing, by the way, there was a kingdom in West Africa, and the king's name was Ra Sujata. He went to Egypt, and it's so much gold. It's the Malian kingdom. It's not Mali today. I think it's Guinea and part of Ghana. They didn't monetize gold. I think it was in the 1500s. He went to Cairo. They took so much gold that they destabilized the economy in Cairo for at least 2 decades. Because, of course, the Egyptians wanted that gold. Oh, do you want this? Yeah, go ahead. Give me a sack of potatoes. Here, 50 pounds of gold. So, exploitation has been a part of the world history in many directions. But the problems of colonialism are vast. We were colonies, too.
Hi, my name is Daisy Barber, and I'm double majoring in Peace, Foreign Defense, and Human Development and Family Science. And I'm particularly interested in the development of children in politically turmoil environments. And I'm right now interested in Central Africa. So I was wondering what you think the responsibility of other governments is in the intervention of child development in these regions, whether it's through education or health or all through third party. I don't know.
Well, again, it's the same issue. Yes, children everywhere deserve to have health, education, whether it's in the Central African Republic or Herkimer, New York, where I grew up. But it's very difficult for a foreign country to order another country to do that. Yes, they probably would be thrilled. You want to set up a child care academy in Central African Republic or DRC because they might not want to do it themselves. But not everyone values education in the same way, and some families are just, they have so much difficulty just even surviving, and they didn't plan to have those children. Maybe women didn't have the choice to not have a child. I remember I met a Djiboutian woman, and she told a story that has always remained with me. She was very well educated, in fact. I don't remember exactly which professional career she had chosen, but she said her mother would make her, in France they have this system, the dictée, and you write, the teacher dictates and you write it down. That's how you learn how to do all the accents and everything, and you never get a perfect score. It's impossible. So she would write down what the teacher said, and you were supposed to come home and read it out loud. And their mother would, after she'd read the first 2, 3 words, her mother would say, no, that's wrong, repeat. And then the mother would look at it, and the girl would have to repeat it 50 times. The mother was never satisfied. And when she was around 13, she realized her mother just made her repeat it, and then she realized my mother is unable to read. Well, she just said to her daughter, repeat. You made a mistake in the 3rd sentence, repeat it. And that's how her daughter actually improved her reading, repeating it to a mother who was illiterate. It's unbelievable. But the challenges are really tremendous, but the countries themselves have to decide they're going to do it. I don't think France or America or Japan or China can dictate it. Well,
Hi, just want to say thank you all for being here. This was really interesting and informative. My question is about development. I feel like a lot of the recent discourse about development in the continent has been about moving away from imposing American values, Western values, just as we were talking about, onto these countries. So I guess in your view, what are some ways that we can promote cooperation with the continent and less about imposition or imposing our values? How can we make it more balanced? How can we engage in discussions?
I mean, if you wanted to be really clinical about it, you just say, tell these countries, well, we're interested in you because of this. If you want to be interested in us because of that, we can work together. Because actually, it's in Africa's interest to be involved with other countries, to have trade, to export the minerals, to get some assistance. So they have every reason in the world to cooperate with the United States. I don't want to read into what you're saying. Africa loves democracy. When you do polls, you'll see they like democracy. I think they like American values. They don't like all American values. They don't like it. I mean, this was very hard. I don't know, someone asked me about it today in one of the classes, but it's come up in other contexts with students. You know, LGBTQI, I know there are different acronyms that people would choose to use, but you know what I'm talking about. These are not welcome ideas in Africa. So if you're saying imposing of American values, we consider the rights of all people as human rights. Their orientation, we consider that a human right, and that is our policy. That's not accepted in many parts of the world, not just in Africa. But some African countries, even though they need the aid, they said, no, we're not going to work with you because of that. That's really tough. I don't know any diplomat in the world that's been able to succeed on that one. Very tough.
I'm going to take this last question, and please go ahead, sir.
Yeah, hello. My name is David, and I just had a question about, you mentioned China had a lot of friendly relations with African countries, and they're trying to be very involved in the development and the future of African countries. So my question is, what kind of motives does China and Russia have with African countries? And if that leads to a conflict down the line, like you said, some countries said they wouldn't pay back their loans, their debt. What kind of conflict would that look like? And where would the U.S. stand if these large nations had problems with each other?
Yeah, there are a lot of ifs that we don't know, but I think China has an interest in exporting labor it no longer needs. They're much more high-tech. They're no longer just a country which is making cotton fabric and selling it. They are very high-tech, making computers, but they have a huge number of people, over 1 billion people, and they're happy to send people who don't really have a place in China earn money in Africa. They definitely want to expand their reach for commercial reasons so they can transport products to Africa, have Africa buy African products, and also get minerals and things like that. Russia is much more of a question mark for me because they're actually selling weapons to some countries, and Russia's been doing that all over the world in the gray arms market and so on, but also training some of the leaders, military leaders, coup plotters and others in some African countries. So I don't know what would happen. I don't know that China, when the US had bad loans in Latin America, Citibank and others had to restructure. We didn't go to war with those countries to get the money back. I hope China wouldn't do that. There's a joke that if the bank calls you and says, you owe us $1,000, you have a problem, and you know you do, they call you and you owe $3 million, then you say, we have a problem. Because that bank has a problem just as much as you do. So Africa, China is, I don't know what will happen. This is for down the road. But meanwhile, the countries can't pay the money they owe. And if there is a conflict, I'm not sure I'm sure some countries will tell African leaders, we told you so, but it'll be a little late. Then we'll be dealing with damage control. And our relationship with China will change again. It's changed a lot. When I first went to Djibouti, before that, we worked with the Chinese on healthcare. We were going to build a clinic, they would provide the medical care. There were high hopes that we could work together. Not anymore.
Thank you.
Will you join me in a round of applause to thank Ambassador?